For 40 years, he was a ghost, a phantom who terrorized California, committing at least 13 murders, 50 rapes, and over 100 burglaries. He called his victims in the dead of night, whispering threats years after his attacks. Police had his DNA. They had his fingerprints. They had recordings of his voice. But they had no idea who he was. Then, in 2018, a detective had an idea so unconventional, so outside the box, that it would revolutionize criminal investigations forever. She didn't use a police database. She didn't use traditional forensics. Instead, she turned to a website that millions of people used to find their ancestors. And what happened next would finally unmask the most prolific serial predator in American history. This is the story of how a genealogy website, a determined detective, and cutting-edge DNA technology brought down the Golden State Killer. And I'm going to show you exactly how they did it, step by step, in a way that had never been done before. Before we dive into the breakthrough that caught him, you need to understand just how terrifying this man was. Because the Golden State Killer wasn't just one criminal. For decades, investigators thought they were hunting 3 different people. In the mid-1970s, a serial burglar known as the Visalia Ransacker broke into over 100 homes in Visalia, California. He didn't just steal. He rummaged through women's underwear drawers, moved objects around, and seemed to get satisfaction from violating people's private spaces. When a journalist was murdered trying to stop a burglary, the ransacker vanished. Then, in 1976, a new predator emerged in Sacramento. The East Area Rapist began a reign of terror that would last 5 years and leave 50 women traumatized. His method was horrifyingly calculated. He'd break in while couples slept, shine a flashlight in their faces, and tie up the man while assaulting the woman. Sometimes he'd stack dishes on the man's back, threatening to kill everyone if he heard the dishes fall. But here's what made him different from other criminals. He was prepared. He'd studied his victims for weeks, knew their schedules, and sometimes even called them before and after the attacks. He wore a mask. He whispered to disguise his voice, and he left almost no evidence. Then in 1979, the East Area Rapist disappeared from Sacramento. Investigators thought maybe he'd been caught for something else, or perhaps he'd died. They had no idea that their nightmare was just beginning. Because he hadn't stopped. He'd moved south to Southern California and escalated to murder. In February 1978, a young couple in Rancho Cordova was found bludgeoned to death in their home. Then another couple in Goleta. Then another in Dana Point. The attacks continued through 1986, with the killer targeting couples in their homes, finding them, and murdering them with savage brutality. Investigators in different jurisdictions didn't immediately connect these crimes. Southern California detectives didn't know about the East Area Rapist up north. And nobody suspected these murders were connected to the Visalia Ransacker from years earlier. But one detective did see the pattern. His name was Richard Shelby, and in the early 2000s he began comparing case files. The method of entry was similar. The binding technique was identical. And when DNA technology advanced enough to test old evidence, the proof was undeniable. The East Area Rapist and the Southern California Killer were the same person. They now had a serial predator who'd committed crimes across California for over a decade. They gave him a new name, the Golden State Killer. But even with this knowledge, even with his DNA profile in their database, they were no closer to catching him. His DNA didn't match anyone in Cody's, the FBI's criminal DNA database. His fingerprints didn't match anyone in the system. It was as if he'd never existed in any official capacity. Decades passed. Survivors grew older, still haunted by their attacks. Families of murder victims lost hope. The case grew cold, buried under thousands of unsolved files. And the Golden State Killer lived free, hiding in plain sight. By 2017, the Golden State Killer case was considered essentially unsolvable. The crimes had occurred decades ago. The suspect would be in his 60s or 70s if he was still alive. And despite having one of the most complete DNA profiles of any unknown suspect, investigators had exhausted every traditional avenue. They'd run the DNA through every criminal database. Nothing. They'd followed up on thousands of tips. All dead ends. They'd even released a recording of his voice from a disturbing phone call he'd made to one of his victims, taunting her years after the attack. The public was horrified, but nobody could identify him. Detective Paul Holes had been obsessed with the case for 24 years. He'd spent his entire career in the Contra Costa County District Attorney's Office working cold cases, and the Golden State Killer was his white whale. He was set to retire in March 2018, and the thought of leaving this case unsolved haunted him. Then he connected with Barbara Raventer, a genealogist who'd helped solve another cold case using an unconventional method. She'd used a public genealogy website called GEDmatch to identify a murder victim by uploading crime scene DNA and finding genetic relatives. When Holes heard about this technique, something clicked. If you could identify an unknown victim through their relatives' DNA, couldn't you identify an unknown suspect the same way? It had never been done before, but they were out of options. Here's where the story gets really interesting, because what they were about to do would change criminal investigations forever. GEDmatch is a free website where people upload their DNA results from companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com to find relatives. It works because we all share DNA with our cousins, even distant ones. The closer the relative, the more DNA we share. Barbara Raventer's idea was brilliant in its simplicity. Upload the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch and see if any of his relatives had uploaded their DNA. Then, using traditional genealogy research, build a family tree backward from those relatives until you found a suspect who matched the right age, location, and profile. But there were massive challenges. First, this had never been used to solve a serial crime case before. The legal implications were unclear. Was it an invasion of privacy? Would the evidence be admissible in court? Second, the technical challenge was enormous. They wouldn't find a direct match. They'd be lucky to find third or fourth cousins. And from there, they'd need to build a family tree that could span hundreds of people. In December 2017, they decided to try. They uploaded the Golden State Killer's DNA profile to GEDmatch under a pseudonym. And they waited. The results came back with several matches. Not close relatives, but distant cousins who shared small amounts of DNA with the killer. It was exactly what they needed. Now came the hard part. Raventer got to work building family trees. She used the DNA matches as starting points, then traced backward through census records, birth certificates, death certificates, and obituaries. She was looking for common ancestors, the people who connected these distant cousins to each other, and to the killer. Think of it like this. Imagine you're trying to identify someone, but all you know is that their great-great-grandfather was one of 5 brothers. You'd need to trace down every branch of that family tree, tracking every descendant, until you found someone who fit the profile of your suspect. That's exactly what Raventer did. And the trees were massive, sprawling across generations and containing hundreds of individuals. But here's what made the breakthrough possible, and what made this case different from anything that had come before. The genealogist wasn't working alone. She had something that would narrow down hundreds of suspects to just one. And it was hiding in plain sight in police records from 40 years ago. As Raventer built her family trees, she worked closely with investigators to narrow the pool of potential suspects. They knew several key facts about the Golden State Killer that would help eliminate people. He was a white male who would have been between 18 and 30 years old during the first attacks in the mid-1970s. That meant in 2018, he'd be somewhere between 60 and 72 years old. He'd lived in or had strong connections to Sacramento, Contra Costa, and Southern California during specific time periods. This geographical requirement was crucial and eliminated many branches of the family trees. He was physically fit and athletic during the crimes, able to leap tall fences and overpower victims. This suggested someone who might have had military or law enforcement training. He likely had no serious criminal record, since his DNA and fingerprints weren't in any criminal database. Working with these parameters, Raventer focused on branches of the family tree that had connections to Northern California in the 1970s. The work was painstaking. Every name had to be researched. Every person's age, location, and background had to be verified. Months passed. The team worked in secret, knowing that if word leaked out, the suspect might flee or destroy evidence. Detective Holes was approaching retirement. The pressure was enormous. Then, in March 2018, the trees began to converge on a single family line. The DNA matches pointed to ancestors who'd lived in the Sacramento area. Following the descendants down through the generations, one name kept appearing as a potential match: Joseph James DeAngelo. He was 72 years old in 2018. He'd been a police officer in Exeter, California, near Visalia, during the Visalia ransacker period. Then he transferred to the Auburn Police Department in the Sacramento area, right where and when the East Area Rapist attacks began. He'd been fired from the Auburn Police Department in 1979 for shoplifting dog repellent, the same year the East Area Rapist attacks stopped in Northern California. The timeline was too perfect to be coincidental. They had their suspect, but they still needed definitive proof. They needed his DNA. This is where the investigation becomes a race against time, because they needed to get DeAngelo's DNA without tipping him off that he was under surveillance. The team set up watch on DeAngelo's home in Citrus Heights, a suburb of Sacramento. They watched him go about his daily routine, a seemingly ordinary elderly man. He lived on a quiet street, drove a truck, and seemed to live a normal, unremarkable life. They needed a DNA sample that he'd discard in public, something called abandoned DNA that's legally obtainable without a warrant. They followed him to stores, hoping he'd throw away a cup or a tissue. Days passed with no opportunity. Then, on April 18, 2018, they got their chance. DeAngelo drove to a Hobby Lobby store. When he left, surveillance teams moved in and retrieved items he'd touched, hoping to collect enough DNA for testing. The samples went to the crime lab immediately. The forensics team processed the DNA and compared it to the Golden State Killer's profile from the crime scenes. It was a perfect match. After 42 years, thousands of investigator hours, and countless dead ends, they finally had him. Joseph James DeAngelo was the Golden State Killer, but they still had to arrest him without incident. DeAngelo was 72, but they knew from his history that he was cunning and dangerous. They'd seen what he was capable of. They weren't taking any chances. On April 24, 2018, a tactical team surrounded DeAngelo's house in the early morning hours. They had arrest warrants for multiple murders. When DeAngelo emerged from his home, walking with a cane and looking like any other elderly man, they moved in. "Show me your hands," officers shouted. DeAngelo seemed confused, asking, "I have a roast in the oven," as they handcuffed him. He showed no recognition of why he was being arrested, no admission of guilt, just confusion as they led him away. But the officers knew exactly who they had. After 4 decades, the monster who'd terrorized California was finally in custody. The arrest made international headlines. But what happened next in the interrogation room would be equally shocking. Because when investigators finally sat down with the Golden State Killer, his reaction wasn't what anyone expected. When detectives sat down across from Joseph James DeAngelo in the interrogation room, they expected something. Denial, maybe, anger, perhaps even an attempt to manipulate them as serial offenders often do. What they got was silence and what appeared to be a complete mental shutdown. DeAngelo sat hunched over, barely moving. When asked questions, he muttered incoherently or didn't respond at all. He rocked back and forth. He spoke to himself in strange voices, to the investigators who'd spent decades hunting him, who knew how calculated and intelligent he'd been during his crimes. This performance was insulting. "I have no knowledge of these crimes," he mumbled when pressed. Then he'd lapse back into confused muttering, pretending not to understand what was happening. The forensic psychologists who evaluated him suspected he was malingering, faking mental incompetence to avoid prosecution. But proving it would take time they didn't have. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Even if he never said a word, the DNA evidence alone would convict him. Meanwhile, news of his arrest sent shockwaves through the communities he'd terrorized. Survivors of his attacks learned that their nightmare was finally over. Families of murder victims finally had a name to attach to their grief. And the details that emerged about DeAngelo's life were chilling in their ordinariness. He'd been married twice and had children. He'd lived in normal neighborhoods, shopped at normal stores, and interacted with normal people. His neighbors described him as grumpy and reclusive, but not particularly suspicious. He'd hidden in plain sight for over 40 years. If not for the genealogical DNA breakthrough, he might have died without ever being identified. The question everyone asked was, how did no one know? How did his family not suspect? How did he lead a double life for so long? Joseph James DeAngelo was born in 1945 in Bath, New York. His childhood appeared relatively normal on the surface, though records indicate his family moved frequently due to his father's military service. In 1964, DeAngelo graduated from Folsom High School in California. He attended Sierra College and then served in the Navy during the Vietnam War. After his discharge, he attended California State University, Sacramento, earning a degree in criminal justice. Here's where his story takes a dark turn. In 1973, DeAngelo was hired as a police officer in Exeter, California, a small town near Visalia. This was the same time and place where the Visalia ransacker was terrorizing the community. Think about that for a moment. DeAngelo was a police officer, someone sworn to protect and serve, while simultaneously committing burglaries and what investigators believe was his first murder. He had access to police reports, knew how investigations worked, and understood exactly how to avoid detection. It was the perfect cover. In 1976, DeAngelo transferred to the Auburn Police Department, closer to Sacramento. His police personnel file described him as a dedicated officer. His supervisors had no complaints about his work. Meanwhile, the East Area Rapist attacks began in the Sacramento area, following the exact pattern of someone with law enforcement training. DeAngelo would work his police shifts, then prowl neighborhoods at night, selecting victims and studying their routines. He used his knowledge of police procedures to avoid leaving evidence. He understood response times, how to disable phone lines, and how to disappear before officers could arrive. His career in Auburn ended in 1979 when he was caught shoplifting a hammer and dog repellent from a store. For a police officer to be caught shoplifting was a major scandal, and he was fired immediately. Investigators now believe he was shoplifting items he planned to use in his crimes. After losing his police job, the East Area Rapist attacks stopped in Northern California. But DeAngelo didn't stop offending. He moved south and escalated to murder, now targeting victims in Southern California communities where he had no police connections and would be even harder to trace. He eventually settled in Citrus Heights and worked as a mechanic in a Save Mart distribution center until his retirement in 2017, just a year before his arrest. He seemed to live a quiet, unremarkable life. But investigators would later discover disturbing evidence in his home. When police executed search warrants on DeAngelo's home and property, what they found provided chilling confirmation of his guilt beyond just the DNA evidence. They found items that had been stolen from victims' homes decades earlier. Jewelry, rings, personal items that survivors could identify as belonging to them or their murdered loved ones. He'd kept trophies, a common behavior among serial offenders. They found notebooks with lists of potential victims, targets he'd selected and studied. They found maps of neighborhoods he'd prowled. They found items that matched witness descriptions from crime scenes 40 years old. But perhaps most disturbing, they found evidence that DeAngelo had been reliving his crimes for decades. He'd saved news clippings about his attacks. He'd kept mementos that would remind him of specific victims. He'd preserved his secret life like a personal museum of horror. Investigators also discovered something that explained part of his method. DeAngelo had an extremely small anatomy, which had been noted by several victims and was part of his physical description. This physical characteristic helped confirm victim testimonies and linked crimes across jurisdictions. The evidence was overwhelming. DeAngelo couldn't claim mistaken identity. He couldn't claim he was framed. The combination of DNA evidence, stolen property, and detailed records of his crimes left no doubt. Prosecutors prepared to seek the death penalty for multiple murders. The trial would be massive, involving testimony from dozens of survivors and family members. It would detail 40 years of terror across California. But before the trial could begin, something unexpected happened. In June 2020, as the world was locked down from a pandemic, DeAngelo stood in a Sacramento courtroom for what should have been the beginning of a lengthy trial. Instead, what happened shocked everyone who'd been following the case. On June 29, 2020, Joseph James DeAngelo stood in Sacramento Superior Court and uttered the words that survivors and victims' families had waited 40 years to hear. Guilty. He pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted to dozens of rapes and burglaries. In exchange for the guilty plea, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty. Instead, DeAngelo would receive 11 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus 15 additional life terms. The plea deal was controversial. Many people felt that DeAngelo deserved the death penalty for his horrific crimes. But prosecutors explained their reasoning. DeAngelo was 74 years old. A death penalty trial could take years, with endless appeals that might outlast his natural life. Meanwhile, survivors and families would be forced to testify and relive their trauma repeatedly. The plea deal guaranteed that DeAngelo would die in prison. It gave survivors certainty and closure, and it allowed for an extensive sentencing hearing where victims could finally confront their attacker. That sentencing hearing lasted 4 days in August 2020. More than 50 survivors and family members gave victim impact statements, many speaking directly to DeAngelo, who sat hunched in a wheelchair, refusing to look at them. They described how his crimes had destroyed their lives. Marriages that ended because of the trauma. Decades of fear and nightmares. Children who grew up without parents. The ripple effects of his violence had touched hundreds of lives beyond his direct victims. Gay Hardwick, who'd been raped by DeAngelo in 1978, spoke directly to him. "I've spent 42 years in a prison of my own mind. You're finally beginning your life sentence, while I'm now ending mine." Debbie Domingo, whose mother was murdered in 1981, told him, "We've all been crying for decades. Now it's your turn." When the statements finally ended, the judge sentenced DeAngelo to life in prison without parole and ordered him removed from the courtroom. As deputies wheeled him away, he never once looked at his victims, never spoke, never showed any emotion or remorse. He's currently incarcerated in a California state prison, in a protective custody unit separated from the general population. He'll spend whatever remains of his life in a cell, finally caged like the predator he is. The capture of Joseph James DeAngelo using genealogical DNA didn't just solve one case. It revolutionized criminal investigations worldwide and sparked an intense debate about privacy, technology, and justice. Since DeAngelo's arrest, the same technique has been used to solve hundreds of cold cases. The method, now called investigative genetic genealogy, has identified previously unknown suspects in murders, rapes, and violent crimes that were decades old. In case after case, families who'd lost hope finally got answers. The 1987 murder of a young couple in Washington state. The 1988 murder of an 8-year-old girl in Indiana. The 1993 murder of a woman in Pennsylvania. Cases that had been cold for 20, 30, even 40 years were suddenly solvable. Law enforcement agencies created specialized genetic genealogy units. The FBI trained investigators in the technique. Private labs began offering services specifically for forensic genetic genealogy. The method that had seemed so experimental in 2017 became standard practice in cold case investigations. But the technique also raised important questions about privacy and consent. When people upload their DNA to genealogy websites to find relatives, they're unknowingly putting their entire family tree into a searchable database. If your third cousin uploads their DNA, police can potentially identify you as a suspect in a crime, even if you've never taken a DNA test yourself. GEDmatch eventually changed its policies, requiring users to opt in if they wanted their DNA to be searchable by law enforcement. Other genealogy companies, like 23andMe and Ancestry.com, established strict policies against law enforcement use without court orders. Privacy advocates argued that genetic surveillance could be abused, that innocent people could become suspects based on familial DNA matches, and that the practice needed regulation and oversight. Law enforcement countered that the technique only used publicly available information and had proven invaluable in bringing violent criminals to justice. The debate continues today. But what's undeniable is that investigative genetic genealogy has given law enforcement a powerful new tool, one that can reach back decades to solve cases that seemed impossible. For the Golden State Killer case specifically, the impact was profound. Detective Paul Holes, who'd worked the case for over 20 years, finally got to see it solved before his retirement. Barbara Raventer's innovative approach proved that genealogy and forensic science could combine in powerful new ways. And most importantly, survivors and victims' families finally got justice and closure after 4 decades. The Golden State Killer case teaches us several important lessons about criminal investigation, technology, and human nature. First, it shows the power of persistence. Detectives like Paul Holes worked this case for decades, never giving up despite having no leads. They kept evidence preserved, kept files organized, and kept believing that someday, somehow, technology would advance enough to catch him. That persistence paid off. Second, it demonstrates the importance of thinking outside the box. Traditional investigative methods had failed completely. DeAngelo's DNA and fingerprints weren't in any criminal database. Standard police work couldn't crack the case. It took someone willing to try an entirely new approach, to use technology in a way it had never been used before, to achieve a breakthrough. Third, it reveals how ordinary monsters can seem. DeAngelo wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in dark alleys. He was a former police officer, a husband, a father, a grandfather. He lived in a normal suburban house and shopped at normal stores. He proves that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. The scariest predators are often the ones who blend in perfectly. Fourth, it reminds us that crimes from decades ago can still be solved. If you're a survivor of an old, unsolved crime, don't give up hope. If you're a family member of a murder victim whose case went cold, keep pushing for answers. Technology is advancing rapidly. DNA techniques that didn't exist 5 years ago are now standard. Cases that seemed impossible are being solved. And finally, It raises important questions about the balance between justice and privacy that our society needs to grapple with. How much genetic surveillance are we comfortable with? Where do we draw the line between solving crimes and respecting privacy? These questions don't have easy answers, but they're conversations we need to have as genetic technology becomes more powerful and more widely used. For 40 years, the Golden State Killer haunted California. He was a ghost who terrified communities, traumatized survivors, and murdered with impunity. Police had his DNA, his fingerprints, his voice, but they couldn't find him. He seemed uncatchable, like he'd gotten away with it forever. Then a genealogist had an idea. What if we could use the DNA that millions of people willingly upload to find their ancestors to instead find a criminal? What if we could turn family trees into investigative tools? What if we could reach back through generations to unmask someone who'd hidden for decades? It worked. Through painstaking research, innovative technology, and determined detective work, they built a family tree that led them to Joseph James DeAngelo. They proved his guilt through DNA evidence that was undeniable. And after 4 decades of freedom, the Golden State Killer was finally brought to justice. DeAngelo is now 76 years old, spending his remaining years in prison. He'll never walk free again. He'll never hurt anyone else. And because of the technique developed to catch him, hundreds of other cold cases have been solved, bringing closure to families who'd lost hope. The Golden State Killer case changed criminal investigation forever. It showed that no matter how much time passes, no matter how well someone thinks they've hidden, justice can still find them. Technology advances, methods improve, and the truth eventually comes out. For the survivors who lived with fear for decades, for the families who mourned without answers, justice was finally served. Took 40 years, but they finally caught him. And the method they used to do it will continue solving cold cases and bringing criminals to justice for generations to come. The ghost is gone. The monster is caged. And because of the DNA breakthrough that caught the Golden State Killer, countless future victims will be spared, and countless past victims will finally get the justice they deserve. If you found this story fascinating, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future deep dives into criminal cases and forensic breakthroughs. Check out my video on related topic next, and let me know in the comments what case you'd like me to cover next. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.